For 68 years, I believed love and sacrifice would be enough. I raised my son alone after his father passed, worked double shifts, sold my jewelry to pay his tuition. I thought one day he'd thank me. But last Sunday, over a dinner I thought was a reconciliation, I learned the truth. My only child had planned to drug me and take everything I'd built. The betrayal burned deeper than any wound I'd ever known. Yet what happened next shocked even me. A silent witness in the shadows had seen it all, and with one text message, changed the course of my life forever. Tonight, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Every twist, every moment my heart shattered and rebuilt itself. Because sometimes, survival means walking away and never looking back. I have lived alone for 12 years now, in the same modest house where every wall still carries echoes of laughter long gone. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I am 68 years old. People say time heals, but I have learned that time only softens the edges of grief. It never erases it. When my husband Robert passed away, I thought the worst pain of my life had come and gone. I was wrong. Losing a spouse is like losing half your soul, but losing the bond with your only child, that is a slow death you feel every day. I raised Daniel alone from the time he was 7. Robert's sudden heart attack left us with no savings, only debts from medical bills. I took 2 jobs, waitress in the morning, cleaner at night, barely sleeping, just to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. I remember coming home at midnight, quietly opening Daniel's bedroom door to see him asleep with his math homework still open, his pencil sliding from his hand. Those moments kept me going. When Daniel was 15, I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to pay for his summer science program. At 19, he was accepted into a good university, and I sold a piece of land Robert and I had planned to retire on so I could cover the tuition the scholarships didn't. People thought I was crazy to give up my security, but I believed in him. One day, I told myself, he'll understand what I gave up so he could have more. The pride I felt when he graduated was indescribable. In his navy blue cap and gown, he looked like a man stepping into his future. I remember the photograph, me standing beside him, my hand on his shoulder, smiling as if every sacrifice had been worth it. And for a while, it seemed that way. He found a job, married Sophie, and they started talking about opening their own restaurant. That was my world. Food, customers, building a place where people felt at home. I thought we'd work together, side by side. When they came to me, excited, asking for help with the down payment on their first location, I didn't hesitate. I sold my last piece of property, the small cabin by the lake Robert loved, to give them the capital. The papers were signed, the restaurant opened, and I stepped back, letting them take the lead. I imagined Sunday dinners there, the 3 of us laughing in the kitchen, Daniel finally seeing me as more than just mom, but as the person who had given him the foundation to stand on. But those dinners never came. The phone calls grew shorter, the visits less frequent. Months would pass without a word. When I stopped by the restaurant one afternoon, Sophie greeted me with a strained smile and told me Daniel was too busy to see me, too busy for his mother. The air between us grew colder, and I began to understand. Gratitude was not coming. Still, I told myself not to give up. Maybe time would soften him, make him remember. I spent my evenings cooking for one, setting the table out of habit only to clear it moments later. I kept the house spotless, not because anyone visited, but because it felt like the one thing I could still control. The walls were lined with photographs, Robert holding baby Daniel, me at Daniel's high school graduation, the 3 of us during Christmas when he was 8. Each frame was proof of the life I had built for him. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window, the glow of the street lamp pooling on my lap, and wonder if he ever thought about me. Did he remember the mornings I walked him to school in the pouring rain because the bus broke down? The nights I stayed up sewing his torn soccer uniform so he could wear it the next day? The countless birthdays where I went without so he could have something special? I wanted to believe he did. I needed to believe it. Then last Sunday, the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was warm, almost hesitant, as if he were stepping onto thin ice. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot lately. Sophie and we'd like you to come over for dinner. I know it's been too long." My heart leapt, but I kept my voice steady. He told me Sophie was making my favorite roast, and for a moment, I imagined the warmth of a family table again. I didn't notice the slight hesitation when he mentioned the address, a part of town far beyond anything they could have afforded before. I hung up, staring at the receiver, as if it might offer more answers. My chest ached with cautious hope. Maybe after all these years, he was ready to acknowledge what I had done for him. Maybe the sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. I took my best dress from the closet, the one I'd worn to his wedding, and laid it across the bed. I polished my shoes until they gleamed, and I pulled out the bottle of aged whiskey Robert had been saving. A peace offering, a bridge between past hurt and future forgiveness. I told myself this dinner could be the start of something new. I didn't know then that it would be the night my illusions shattered forever. The invitation came on an otherwise ordinary Sunday afternoon. I was rinsing out my teacup when the phone rang, a sound that had become rare enough to startle me. I wiped my hands on a dish towel before answering. "Mom?" Daniel's voice was hesitant, the syllable catching in his throat. It had been over 3 years since I'd heard that tone, not the clipped, distant politeness of our occasional holiday calls, but something softer, almost uncertain. "I was thinking, maybe you could come over for dinner tonight," he continued. "It's been too long. Sophie's making that roast you like." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind went blank except for the thud of my heartbeat. It felt like the tiniest crack in a wall I had long thought impenetrable. Then Sophie's voice floated in from the background just loud enough to carry, "Tell her it's the same pot roast she loved so much." I froze. Pot roast? I had never once eaten that with Sophie. In fact, in the few awkward meals we'd shared years ago, she'd seemed almost indifferent to my tastes. The comment pricked at the back of my mind, but Daniel's voice quickly returned, smoothing over the oddity. 7 o'clock? I'll text you the address." I agreed, hanging up with a mix of hope and unease. As I laid the receiver back in its cradle, my eyes drifted to the framed photo on the sideboard, Daniel at 12, grinning under a knit hat I'd made for him. I had worked an overnight cleaning job that winter, the kind where the heating barely worked, and my fingers went numb scrubbing office floors just to buy him the good wool yarn. He'd worn that hat every day until it frayed at the seams. I let myself sink into those memories, the years when love was measured not in grand gestures, but in countless small sacrifices. There were mornings I'd leave the house before dawn, the frost crunching under my shoes, my breath puffing white in the air. I'd spend hours on my feet waitressing, smiling through the ache in my knees, knowing that every tip was another textbook, another school trip paid for. At night, after my shift cleaning the law offices downtown, I'd walk home past shop windows glowing with warmth I couldn't afford, my coat too thin against the wind. I would think of Daniel sleeping safe in his bed, and the cold didn't matter as much. Those years blurred into a single, unbroken rhythm. Work, save, give. It wasn't a burden, it was my purpose. I didn't keep track of what I gave up for him. I just knew that the more I poured into him, the further he could go. Snapping back to the present, I shook off the heaviness in my chest. This dinner might be the turning point I'd prayed for. Maybe Sophie's odd comment was just a slip of the tongue, a mistaken assumption Daniel had passed along. I went to my bedroom and opened the wardrobe. The dress I chose was deep green, the one Robert had always said brought out the color in my eyes. I pressed the wrinkles out with slow, careful movements, as if smoothing the fabric might also smooth the jagged years between Daniel and me. From the back of the closet, I pulled out the small oak box where I kept my most treasured possessions. Inside was the bottle of aged whiskey Robert had been saving. "For a special occasion," he'd said, though life had never quite given us the right moment. If tonight was truly about reconciliation, this could be my peace offering. When Daniel's text arrived with the address, my eyebrows lifted. Montclair. The kind of neighborhood with tree-lined streets, old money estates, and homes that looked more like small museums. I couldn't imagine how they afforded it, but I pushed the thought aside. As the sun dipped lower, I wrapped the bottle in brown paper and called a cab. On the ride there, I found myself staring out at the city shifting into twilight. Shopkeepers flipping signs to closed, streetlights humming to life. My hands rested on the bottle in my lap, not just to steady it, but to steady myself. I told myself not to overthink, not to let suspicion overshadow the fragile hope I felt. After all, hadn't I spent years waiting for this? A shared table, a warm meal, and maybe the words I'd longed to hear. "Thank you, Mom." Yet somewhere in the quiet of that cab, Sophie's voice replayed in my mind like a loose thread I couldn't ignore. That roast you loved so much. The words didn't fit. They felt rehearsed. Still, I clung to the possibility that tonight might be different, that I would walk into their home and feel, even for a little while, like I belonged there again. I didn't know then that I was walking towards something far more complicated than a simple family dinner. The cab pulled into a wide circular driveway, and for a moment, I wondered if there had been some mistake. The house before me was palatial. White stone pillars, a manicured lawn that looked like it had been measured blade by blade, and an ornate fountain catching the last orange light of the evening. It was the sort of home I'd only ever seen in glossy magazines, the kind that whispered of wealth that couldn't be earned in a lifetime of honest work. Daniel opened the door before I even had a chance to knock. His smile was broad, his hug a touch too tight, like an actor hitting a well-rehearsed mark. "Mom, you look wonderful," he said, stepping back to study me. His suit was tailored, his cufflinks glinting under the chandelier light. Sophie appeared beside him, her silk dress skimming the floor, her perfume expensive and deliberate. Inside, the air smelled faintly of flowers and something rich simmering in the kitchen. My heels clicked against marble as I followed them into the dining room. Everything was immaculate, the silverware perfectly aligned, the china gleaming under the warm glow of a crystal chandelier. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a woman in a neat, black uniform moving quietly along the edges of the room. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, her posture straight. When our eyes met, there was a flicker, brief, sharp, like a candle flame disturbed by wind. I couldn't place it at first, but it wasn't the polite curiosity of a stranger. It was warning. Daniel pulled out my chair, his smile never faltering. "We're so glad you could make it, Mom. It's been too long." "I'm glad too," I said, though the words felt cautious in my mouth. Sophie poured wine into my glass, her nails perfectly manicured. "We want tonight to be about family," she said warmly, starting fresh. We began eating. The roast tender, the potatoes buttery and perfectly seasoned. Daniel asked about my health, my day-to-day life. Then, seamlessly, the conversation shifted. "So, Mom," he began, cutting into his meat with precise strokes, "have you thought more about retirement? You've worked so hard for so long." "Not really," I admitted. "The restaurants keep me busy. It's what your father and I built together." Sophie leaned forward slightly, her expression soft but her eyes sharp. "But you can't work forever, right? What's the plan? Long term?" I felt a faint tightening in my chest. "One day at a time," I replied. Daniel chuckled lightly as though I just said something endearing. "Of course, but it's smart to think ahead, especially with assets. Have you considered putting things in writing? You know, for peace of mind." Their words were smooth, practiced. Each question sounded innocent enough, but together they formed a net, drawing me toward the same subject. What would happen to everything I owned when I no longer could run it myself? The housekeeper, Maria, as Sophie introduced her briefly, moved between the kitchen and the table, topping off water glasses and replacing dishes with quiet efficiency. But every time she passed behind me, I caught that same flicker in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. Something in the way her gaze lingered for half a second too long, her jaw set like someone holding back words. I tried to push away the unease building in my gut. After all, maybe this was just what reconciliation looked like. People asking the questions they'd avoided for years. And yet, Daniel refilled my wine glass before I realized it was empty. "You've done so much, Mom. It's only right that your wishes are honored when the time comes." "That's a morbid way to put it," I said, attempting a smile. Sophie tilted her head. "Not morbid, just practical." Maria passed by again, her tray clinking softly. As she set down a new dish, her eyes met mine, and this time, the message was unmistakable. A quick, almost imperceptible shake of her head, as though telling me to be careful. My hand tightened around my fork. I forced myself to focus on the conversation, but each question from Daniel and Sophie seemed to circle the same drain: my finances, my plans, my signature. It was all so perfectly polite, so flawlessly staged, that it made the air feel heavy. The warmth of the room pressed in on me, and the wine sat strangely in my stomach. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, marking the seconds of a dinner that suddenly didn't feel like mine at all. Halfway through the meal, as Daniel was describing some vague investment opportunity that required just the right timing, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. It wasn't the familiar soft chime of a family member's message. It was sharper, more insistent. I excused myself just long enough to slip a hand into my pocket, shielding the screen from Daniel and Sophie with the edge of the tablecloth. The message was stark, every letter in capital font. "Stand up and leave, don't say anything to your son." My pulse jumped. The words hit like a cold hand gripping the back of my neck. For a moment, I wondered if it was a mistake, a wrong number, a prank. Surely no one would send something so urgent to me without explanation. I slid the phone face down beside my plate, trying to keep my breathing even. "Everything okay, Mom?" Daniel's tone was casual, but his eyes flicked toward the phone, lingering a moment too long. "Just the restaurant manager," I lied. "Probably something minor." Sophie's smile was instantaneous and warm, but her hand moved to the wine bottle, topping off my glass with almost theatrical care. "Then let's not let it interrupt our evening." I took a small sip, willing myself to calm down. The roast was good, tender, flavorful, just the way I liked it. Maybe the message really was nothing, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed the details I'd ignored before. The first glass of wine had left me with a faint dizziness, a warm fuzziness that didn't quite match what I'd eaten. Sophie's attentiveness to my glass was almost rehearsed. She poured before I could refuse, her eyes always on my reaction. "Mom," Daniel said, "have you ever considered hiring someone to run the restaurants? You'd still own them, of course, but you could step back, relax." I smiled faintly. "I've considered it, but the work keeps me sharp." "True," he replied, leaning in slightly. "Still, we could help you with the paperwork. Get everything in order for the future." There it was again, that circling back to my assets. The phone in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying not just a message, but the weight of a decision I didn't yet understand. Across the table, Maria appeared with a fresh dish of vegetables. As she reached past me, the polished silver spoon slid from the edge of the tray, hitting the floor with a bright, metallic clang. She bent to pick it up, and for a brief moment, her eyes lifted to mine. It was not an accident, that glance. In her gaze was the same urgency as the text, a silent plea, a warning I couldn't quite decode. I tried to keep my expression neutral as she straightened and carried the tray back toward the kitchen. Daniel refilled his own glass, his movements calm and unhurried. "You've built something incredible, Mom. We just want to make sure it's safe. You know, if anything ever happened." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like the careful laying of a trap. Still, I pushed back against the rising unease. This was my son. Whatever distance had grown between us, surely he wouldn't harm me. And Sophie, polished, poised Sophie, might be ambitious, but she wouldn't risk something criminal. I told myself these things as the conversation carried on, my laugh coming a second too late, my smile a fraction too tight. Yet, every so often I'd catch Sophie's eyes tracking my glass, or see Daniel's subtle nod when she reached for the bottle. The air seemed thicker now. The chandelier light felt sharper, like it was revealing too much. My mind swung between two poles, the warm hope of reconciliation and the creeping suspicion that something else was at work here. I glanced toward the kitchen again. Maria had reappeared, wiping her hands on a folded towel, her eyes flicking once more toward me before she disappeared down the hallway. If the message had been a prank, why did her look match its urgency? If it was real, what danger could I possibly be in? Daniel began telling a story about a client who had turned a small property into a fortune, but I barely heard him. The words from that message repeated in my mind like a drumbeat. "Stand up and leave. Don't say anything to your son." I tightened my grip on my fork, the cool metal grounding me. For now, I decided I would stay seated. I would smile, answer their questions, and watch. Really watch. And if the moment came when the warning made sense, I would be ready. I dabbed my lips with the cloth napkin and offered an apologetic smile. "Would you mind if I freshened up?" "Just the bathroom," I said lightly, as if the idea had just occurred to me. "Of course," Daniel replied instantly. "Second door on the left." Sophie's eyes followed me as I rose, her smile never touching the sharpness in her gaze. I moved down the hall at a measured pace, my heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. But when I reached the door Daniel had indicated, I kept walking, past framed landscapes and spotless side tables, toward where I'd seen Maria disappear earlier. The kitchen was silent except for the low hum of an industrial refrigerator. Maria was nowhere in sight, but I spotted a door at the far end. I pressed my palm to the cool brass handle and eased it open. A rush of evening air met my face. Beyond lay a neatly trimmed lawn bordered by tall hedges. The scent of damp earth and cut grass filled my lungs, and for a moment I felt like I could breathe again. I slipped across the lawn toward a small gate. The hinges gave a muted groan as I pushed it open and stepped onto a quiet street. Street lamps cast pale circles of light, and the occasional car murmured by in the distance. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I scrolled to the message. No name, just the number. My thumb hovered for a second before I pressed call. It rang twice before a low, steady voice answered. "I hoped you would call." I froze. "Who is this?" There was a pause, then, "Maria, I work for your son." The breath I'd been holding escaped in a rush. "You sent the message?" "Yes, I didn't know how else to warn you without them noticing." Her voice was calm, but there was tension threaded through it. "Mrs. Harper, you need to listen carefully. Daniel is in deep trouble." I found myself pacing the sidewalk. What kind of trouble? Debt to dangerous people. People who don't use lawyers to collect. He owes them over $2 million. They've given him a deadline. If he can't pay, they'll hurt him. Or worse. The words rattled inside me. "So what does that have to do with me?" Maria's tone hardened. "He's desperate. They've come up with a plan to get the money fast by taking everything you own. Tonight, Sophie added something to your wine. It makes you disoriented, compliant. They have legal documents ready in the study. All they need is your signature." I stopped walking. The quiet street suddenly felt heavier, as if every shadow might hold a pair of listening ears. You're certain? I asked, though my voice was little more than a whisper. I heard them, Maria said without hesitation. 3 days ago, in Daniel's office. They thought I didn't understand English well enough to follow. They talked about the dosage, the timing, even which pen to use so your signature would match. I didn't think you'd believe me if I told you face to face, so I waited until the dinner started. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind flashing back over the evening, the way Sophie refilled my glass without asking, the faint dizziness after only a few sips, Daniel's repeated talk about my future plans. The pieces slid together with sickening clarity. You should go home, Maria urged. Don't go back inside. I looked down the street toward where the road curved into darkness. My driver app was still open. A car could be here in minutes. Safety was only a few taps away, but another part of me, the part that had built businesses from nothing, that had raised a son alone and survived grief, bristled at the thought of slipping away like a frightened animal. They'll try again if I don't stop them, I murmured. Then at least protect yourself first, Maria insisted. Move your money. Tell your lawyer. You have to make sure they can't touch anything. A set of headlights appeared at the far end of the street. My ride. I hesitated. Maria, why are you helping me? For the first time, her voice softened. Because you've always been kind to me. You looked at me like a person, not just the help. I couldn't watch them do this to you. The car pulled up beside me, and I slid into the back seat. As we drove away from the mansion's glowing windows, I felt the weight of her words settle in my chest. Daniel's debt was not my burden to carry, but his betrayal was now my reality. The Uber driver turned slightly in his seat as I closed the door. Evelyn Harper? Yes, I replied cautiously, buckling my seatbelt. For a moment, he studied me with a puzzled smile. You might not remember me. Frank Delaney. I used to work with your husband at the docks, back before he passed. Recognition hit like a warm breeze. Frank, yes, of course. You two shared those terrible coffee thermoses. He chuckled. That's right, small world, huh? It was almost comforting, seeing a familiar face in the middle of such chaos, until his next words cut through that comfort like a blade. I've actually been to that house a few times in the last couple months, always picking up men in suits. Didn't seem like friends or family. They said they were there to talk business with Daniel. I stiffened. Business? Frank shrugged, eyes on the road. Didn't ask questions, but they weren't the friendly type. One of them had a busted knuckle, like he'd been in a fight. Another kept making calls in a language I didn't recognize, all cash fares. The streetlights blurred past, each one throwing a little more light on the shadows Maria had described. I pulled my phone out again. Maria, I said when she answered, these visitors, they wouldn't happen to be connected to Daniel's debt, would they? Yes, she said without hesitation. Those are the people he owes, dangerous men. They don't negotiate twice. He promised them the full amount in 11 days. My breath caught. 11 days. That's why he's rushing this plan, Maria continued. The powder Sophie put in your drink, it's called zetraline. It makes alcohol 5 times stronger in the body. You'd feel relaxed, maybe a little foggy, but still able to hold a pen. Later, you might not even remember signing the papers. A wave of cold moved through me, despite the heater humming in Frank's car. The image of Sophie's perfect smile and Daniel's careful, watchful eyes locked into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too blind to see before. The realization cut deeper than fear. My own son had looked me in the eye tonight, served me food, asked about my health, all while planning to strip me of everything I'd built. I turned to the window, the city passing by in fractured reflections. Betrayal sat heavy in my chest, heavier than grief had ever been. Frank glanced at me in the rearview mirror. You all right back there? I forced a breath. I will be. Maria's voice was still in my ear, steady but urgent. Mrs. Harper, I understand if you just want to go home, but please. At least call your lawyer before you sleep. Move what you can, change the locks, warn your managers. Daniel knows your routines. I could picture it. Slipping into my house, locking the door, shutting the world out. Safe. But that image twisted quickly into another. Daniel trying this again. Maybe not on me, maybe on someone else he thought was an easier target. No. I straightened in my seat. Frank, can you turn around? He blinked. Turn around? Yes, we're going back to Montclair. Maria's intake of breath crackled over the line. Mrs. Harper, I'm not running, I said, more to myself than to her. If they want my signature, they're going to have to look me in the eye when the police arrive. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. Then Frank nodded, flipping on his turn signal. Your husband would have liked that answer. As the car curved back toward the glowing silhouette of the mansion, my pulse picked up. Not from fear alone, but from a sharper, colder resolve. I had 11 days to stop Daniel's ruin from dragging me down with him, and the first step was going to happen tonight. The mansion looked exactly as I'd left it, golden light spilling from the tall windows, the faint echo of conversation muffled by thick walls. But this time, I didn't walk toward it alone. 2 unmarked police cars idled without headlights a block away, their engines low and steady. I thanked Frank quietly and stepped out. The night air was crisp, laced with the faint scent of the garden's clipped hedges. My heels crunched on the gravel of the curved driveway, each step deliberate. When the heavy oak door opened, Daniel stood there, smile stretched tight over something brittle. Mom, there you are. We were worried, sick. I just needed some fresh air, I said evenly, letting my gaze drift past him into the warm glow of the foyer. Sophie appeared, hands clasped, her expression perfectly arranged in relief. You look better already, she said. Come, the roast will get cold. I stepped inside. The familiar scent of pot roast mingling with polished wood and something faintly metallic, the tang of nerves in the air. The police were out there, waiting for my signal, but for now, the performance had to continue. Daniel pulled out my chair with exaggerated courtesy. We were just talking about old times. I lowered myself into the seat, noting how his eyes flickered toward my untouched wine glass, now refilled. Sophie's hand hovered just above it, as if expecting me to reach for it. Why don't we start with a toast? She suggested. I smiled politely but made no move toward the glass. Before we do, Daniel, I was thinking about the summer you were 16. Do you remember that? He froze for half a second, then laughed too loudly. Of course. It was the year you insisted on painting the fence by yourself, I continued, keeping my tone light. You said you didn't need any help, but you left the gate half finished. Sophie glanced between us, her brow tightening ever so slightly. Yeah, I guess I wasn't much for finishing what I started back then, Daniel said, and the words hung in the air, weighted with unintended truth. Maria moved quietly through the room, collecting empty plates from the earlier courses. Our eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and she gave the smallest nod. Everything was in place. I kept my voice steady, my smile practiced. It's strange, isn't it? How some patterns follow us into adulthood. Daniel's gaze sharpened. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, nothing, I said lightly. Just that we sometimes think we've changed, when maybe we haven't at all. Sophie shifted in her seat, her perfectly rehearsed ease beginning to crack. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Daniel. From somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked. The faint, deliberate sound of movement. My heart thudded, but I didn't look away from them. The officers would be in position soon. Sophie reached for her glass. Shall we? I leaned forward slightly, keeping my hands folded on the table. Actually, I'd like to savor the moment a little longer. After all, it's not every day we get to clear the air. Daniel's smile twitched. Mom, if there's something on your mind... Oh, there is, I said softly, my eyes locking on his. and I think tonight might be the perfect time to talk about it." The warmth of the chandelier's light felt almost oppressive now, pressing down as the air between us tightened. Outside, somewhere beyond the manicured lawn, I knew the law was waiting. All I had to do was keep them here long enough. The mansion loomed ahead, its warm golden glow spilling across the manicured lawn as though nothing had changed. From a distance, it looked welcoming, a picture of comfort and wealth. But I knew better now. It was a stage, and every smile, every word spoken tonight had been part of a carefully rehearsed performance. The unmarked police cars idled quietly a block away, their headlights dark. I'd spoken with the officers in the car ride back, explained enough to make them believe me, but not so much that I lost the thread of my own plan. They understood the need for subtlety. Their instructions had been simple: give us a sign and we'll move in. Frank, still behind the wheel, eased the car to a stop at the edge of the driveway. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Evelyn?" I tightened my grip on my purse. Inside, my phone was already open to the emergency text thread with the lead officer. "I'm ready," I said, though my stomach churned with a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. The walk up the driveway felt longer than it had earlier. My heels clicked on the stone path, each step echoing in my ears. The oak door opened before I could reach for the bell. Daniel stood there, smiling too broadly. His eyes flickered with something I recognized now. Not warmth, but calculation. "Mom, thank God you're back. We were worried." "I just needed some fresh air," I said, matching his smile with one of my own, though mine didn't reach my eyes. "It's such a beautiful night." Sophie appeared behind him, her hands clasped in front of her. "You had us so concerned," she said, her voice perfectly modulated. "Come in, please. Let's finish dinner." I stepped inside, letting the familiar scent of pot roast mix with the sharper tang of polish and cleaning solution. Everything looked as perfect as before. The gleaming floors, the expensive paintings, the crystal glasses set at each place. But now, I saw the undercurrent. Sophie's eyes lingered on me a second too long. Daniel's smile was just a touch too stiff. Daniel pulled my chair out for me again, the perfect gentleman. "We were just reminiscing about the old days," he said. I sat down, my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "The old days," I repeated. "I was just thinking about those myself." Sophie leaned forward slightly. "Perhaps we could toast to them." She gestured to my wine glass, which had been refilled while I was gone. I kept my eyes on her. "In a moment," I said softly. "But first, Daniel, do you remember the summer you turned 16? He blinked. "Sure. Why?" "You decided to paint the fence all by yourself," I said. "Said you didn't need any help, but you left the gate unfinished. Said you'd get to it later, but you never did." He laughed awkwardly. "I guess I wasn't great at finishing what I started back then." "Some habits," I said, letting my gaze hold his, "are hard to break." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, not yet, but awareness. Sophie shifted in her seat, glancing toward the clock on the wall, then at Daniel. From somewhere in the house, a faint sound. A floorboard creaking under deliberate weight. I knew the officers were getting into position. I forced my attention back to the table. "Mom," Daniel said, with that charming tone he used when he wanted something. "If there's something you want to say, just say it." "Oh, there's something," I replied. "But timing is everything, don't you think?" Sophie picked up her own glass. "Maybe we should drink first. It'll loosen the conversation." I smiled politely. I've always preferred a clear head for important talks. Maria entered quietly from the kitchen, collecting the empty bread basket. Our eyes met for half a second, and she gave me the smallest nod. Everything was in place. I kept my breathing steady. "It's interesting," I continued, "how life can turn full circle. We raise our children, we give them everything we can, and sometimes they surprise us." Daniel tilted his head, suspicion creeping into his expression. And sometimes, I went on, they forget what was given to them, or worse, they decide they're entitled to take more. The room went still. Sophie's fingers tightened around her glass. Daniel's jaw worked silently for a moment before he forced another smile. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying, Mom." "Don't worry," I said, my voice calm. "You will." Outside, beyond the tall windows, the faint glint of metal caught my eye. A flashlight beam quickly snuffed out. The signal was clear. The trap was ready to spring. I folded my napkin deliberately, laying it beside my plate. "Why don't we all take a deep breath," I said softly, "and enjoy these last few moments of normalcy?" Daniel's gaze hardened. Sophie glanced toward the hallway as if calculating escape routes. I simply smiled, knowing that in a matter of minutes, the stage they'd built so carefully would come crashing down. Daniel opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, movement from the hallway drew my attention. A tall man I'd never seen before stepped into the dining room's periphery. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair slicked back, a gold watch glinting on his wrist. His smile was polite but cold, the kind that never touched the eyes. "Mrs. Harper," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Leonard. I've been advising your son on some pressing financial matters." I took his hand lightly, my instincts screaming. His grip was firm, a little too firm, as though testing me. Daniel's tone was casual, but his eyes darted between us. "Leonard's been helping me streamline some business arrangements. He's just here to make sure everything's in order." I glanced toward the living room where a briefcase sat open on the coffee table. Inside, neatly stacked papers waited. I could see the bold headers even from this distance. Power of attorney, property transfer agreement. Sophie shifted in her chair. "We thought it might be good to go over some documents tonight while everyone's together." Leonard's smile widened just enough to make my skin crawl. "It's always best to settle things before they become urgent." My pulse spiked. This was no financial advisor. The way he carried himself, the controlled precision of his words. I'd seen men like him before, back when my late husband had warned me about the quiet collectors. This was the man Daniel owed money to. I forced a pleasant expression. "Oh, and what sort of documents are these?" "Just some routine authorizations," Leonard said, stepping closer. "Things that could ensure your family's stability." The air seemed to tighten, every sound amplified. The faint hum of the chandelier, the slow tick of the grandfather clock. Inside, my mind was racing. This wasn't just about Daniel's betrayal anymore. I was sitting at a table with a predator who wouldn't hesitate to destroy us both if it suited him. I folded my hands. Well, I wouldn't want to rush into anything. You know, important documents deserve careful reading. Leonard's gaze sharpened, though his tone remained silky. Of course. But sometimes, time isn't on our side. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to sound reassuring. "Mom, it's just formalities. You can sign tonight and be done with it." Sophie's voice chimed in, light but urgent. It really would make things easier. I let a small, thoughtful smile play on my lips. Perhaps after dessert, I never make decisions on an empty stomach. Leonard's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The clock was ticking for him too, and for Daniel. They needed this done tonight. Maria appeared in the doorway with a tray of coffee cups, her movement steady, deliberate. When she set mine down, her fingers brushed the rim in a way that drew my attention. Beneath the saucer, folded so small it was barely visible, was a scrap of paper. I kept my expression neutral as I adjusted the saucer. The faintest scrawl read, 5 minutes. I met Maria's eyes for the briefest second and gave the smallest nod. "Coffee?" I asked brightly, sliding the cup toward Leonard. "You strike me as someone who appreciates the strong stuff." He hesitated, then accepted, though his gaze never left me. The tension was a physical weight now, pressing down with every passing second. I leaned back in my chair, speaking with the kind of measured calm that only comes from years of parenting a stubborn child. Daniel, you remember when you were little and you wanted that red bicycle? You tried to trade your baseball glove for it, even though it wasn't yours to give away. He shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I don't see what that has to... It has everything to do with tonight, I said softly. Because I learned then what I'm seeing now. When you want something badly enough, you'll risk losing everything else to get it. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. From outside, there was the faint crunch of tires on gravel. Leonard's head turned slightly, sensing it, but too late. 3 sharp knocks rattled the front door. Police, open up. Daniel's face drained of color. Sophie froze, her hand halfway to her glass. Leonard's smile vanished entirely, and for the first time all evening I allowed my own to reach my eyes. The flashing red and blue lights painted the mansion's pristine walls in harsh, pulsing streaks. Daniel stood frozen as 2 officers cuffed him, reading his rights in a clipped, unyielding tone. Sophie's voice cracked with high-pitched denials, insisting she didn't know anything, even as another officer guided her toward a separate patrol car. I stayed seated at the table, hands folded neatly, watching without speaking. There was nothing left to say. The documents on the coffee table were now in an evidence bag, the poisoned whiskey, too. The performance they'd rehearsed so carefully had ended, and now came the reckoning. One of the detectives approached me. Mrs. Harper, we'll need a full statement at the station, but first, do you want to speak to either of them before they're taken in? I looked toward Daniel, my son, my only child. His eyes searched mine with the desperation of a drowning man looking for a lifeline. For a long moment, I just stared, taking in the man he'd become. The man who'd thought his mother's life's work was his to steal. No, I said at last, my voice quiet but firm. I have nothing more to say to them. The detective nodded and turned away, signaling the officers to proceed. The doors closed behind them and the house seemed to exhale, the false warmth dissipating into cold emptiness. Back in Brooklyn, my modest house felt like a sanctuary. The first thing I did the next morning was call my lawyer. Within days, every account, property deed, and business asset was moved under new security measures Daniel couldn't touch. I signed fresh banking arrangements, changed passwords, closed loopholes I hadn't even known existed. There were no calls from him in jail that I accepted, no letters I opened. If he wanted redemption, he would have to find it without using me as his safety net. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. The Queens location of Harper's Kitchen had been struggling for months without strong leadership. I needed someone I could trust implicitly, someone who'd already proven their integrity when it counted most. Maria met me at the restaurant's small office a week later, still looking slightly overwhelmed by the turn her life had taken. Mrs. Harper, I don't know if I can manage a whole restaurant, she admitted, clutching the envelope with her official offer letter. I smiled. Maria, you managed to save my life without so much as raising suspicion. Running a kitchen will be the easy part. We walked through the dining room together, the scent of fresh bread drifting in from the ovens. I introduced her to the staff, not as the help who'd once worked in someone else's mansion, but as the new general manager. I saw their respect grow instantly. Over the next few weeks, I poured my energy into Harper's Kitchen like I had in the early days, but this time, with a new kind of satisfaction. Maria brought fresh ideas, treated the team like family, and in return, they worked harder than I'd seen in years. At night, I'd sit in my favorite chair with a cup of chamomile tea, looking at Margaret's photo on the mantel. We did it, I'd murmur, imagining her smile in return. We'd saved what mattered. Not just the business, but the dignity that came from knowing our values had survived the storm. I didn't announce my changes publicly. There were no statements to the press, no dramatic speeches about betrayal or justice. The world didn't need to know the details of my private war. My victory was quieter, lived out in the steady hum of a restaurant where people came for good food and left with full hearts. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if Daniel thought about me in his cell, whether Sophie cursed my name or told herself she'd been the victim too. But those thoughts passed quickly. I had no room for bitterness now, only for the life I was building without them. One afternoon, Maria knocked on my office door. "We just hit record sales for the month," she said, her face lit with the kind of pride that couldn't be faked. I leaned back, savoring the news. Good, that's how it should be. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or affection. It was a quiet Thursday morning when the email came. I was reviewing the week's supplier invoices in my office at Harper's Kitchen when a subject line in my personal inbox caught my eye. Urgent, suspicious account activity. Federal inquiry. At first I thought it was a scam, but as I opened it, my stomach tightened. The message came from a verified financial crimes investigator with the FBI. It listed an account number I didn't recognize, registered under my name, flagged for suspicious transactions over the past 18 months. The amounts were large, irregular, and traced to offshore betting platforms. I printed the email and stared at it, my mind spinning. I had never opened an account at that bank. But Daniel had. My lawyer's words from years ago echoed in my head. If someone has your personal details, they can build an entire shadow life with your name on it. The thought hit like ice water. This was how he'd been laundering gambling money. And now, the trail led straight to me. Within hours, 2 FBI agents sat in my small office, their suits out of place against the warm, bustling restaurant. They laid out the situation with calm precision. The account had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through illegal sports betting syndicates. My signature, forged, was on the opening documents. "Mrs. Harper, we have no reason to believe you initiated these transactions," one agent said, "but if we can't prove that, you could be implicated." It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. Just when I'd thought the worst was behind me, Daniel's shadow reached out again. I took a slow breath. "What do you need from me?" "Cooperation," the agent said simply. "Access to any financial records, correspondence with your son, and, if possible, insight into his contacts." The next week was a blur of digging through old files, handing over everything from Daniel's old text messages to the scanned copies of his business proposals. Each document I found felt like peeling away another layer of deception. Then came the turning point. The agents discovered that Leonard, the so-called financial advisor who had been in Daniel's living room that night, was not only a loan shark but also an active coordinator for a multi-state betting ring. My information was their new bargaining chip to penetrate his network. I agreed to testify, quietly. No press, no fanfare, just the truth, laid out plainly in a secured room at the Bureau's local field office. As the months rolled on, my role shifted from potential suspect to crucial witness. The Bureau traced the money trail, seized accounts, and began dismantling the operation. Each update they gave me felt like a knot loosening in my chest. One evening, after closing, Maria found me sitting in the darkened dining room, the restaurant's neon sign casting a soft glow through the window. "Long day?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "A long year. But I think it's finally ending the right way." She sat across from me. "You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." "I couldn't," I said simply. "Not when my name, my work, my life was being twisted into something dirty. I had to take it back." The following spring, the FBI confirmed that my name was officially cleared. No charges. No suspicion. The account was shut down, the funds seized, the ring's key members indicted. I hung up the phone that day and let out a laugh, the kind that comes from relief so deep it almost feels unreal. I was free, not just from Daniel's betrayal, but from the invisible chains of his crimes. The next morning, Harper's Kitchen reopened after a short renovation. The dining room was filled with the scent of fresh bread, the hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups. Business was good, but my real satisfaction came from knowing that every part of this life was mine, untainted, hard-earned, and guarded. And as I stood at the hostess stand, greeting regulars and new faces alike, I realized that my rebirth hadn't been about erasing the past. It had been about reclaiming my future, one choice at a time. The morning of the sentencing, I stayed in my kitchen. The coffee pot hissed softly, filling the room with a rich aroma, and the sound of rain tapping against the windows set a slow, steady rhythm. Somewhere across the river, in a courtroom lined with polished wood and echoing footsteps, Daniel and Sophie were about to hear the number of years that would define their immediate future. I didn't need to be there. I had already heard enough in the pre-trial hearings to know the outcome. The charges were serious: attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, money laundering. The evidence was airtight. Instead, I pulled on my gardening boots and stepped outside. The earth was damp and fragrant from the early rain. I knelt beside the small vegetable patch I'd started last spring, loosening soil around the new tomato plants. There was comfort in the simplicity of it. The steady work of planting, watering, and waiting. No hidden motives, no false smiles. Just honest labor, the way life was meant to be. Margaret used to say a garden was the perfect mirror of its keeper's heart. Looking at the neat rows, I hoped she'd see mine was finally in order again. Around mid-morning, Maria appeared at the gate, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "I thought you might want an update," she said carefully. I shook my head, smiling faintly. "No details, just tell me they're not walking free." "They're not," she replied simply, handing me the coffee. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. The important thing wasn't the number of years. It was the knowledge that they couldn't reach me anymore. Not physically, not legally, not financially. After she left, I went back inside and set a pot of stew on the stove. The smell of carrots, onions, and beef filled the house, wrapping around me like a blanket. It was the kind of meal Margaret loved to make on rainy days, hearty and slow-cooked, meant to be shared. I'd invited a few close friends over for dinner that night, people who'd stood by me quietly through the chaos, never asking for more than I could give. We'd eat, laugh, maybe open a bottle of wine. No one would bring up Daniel or Sophie. This gathering wasn't about them. It struck me, as I chopped parsley for garnish, that peace often comes not with loud declarations, but with small, deliberate acts. Choosing who to feed, choosing where to spend your time, choosing what to let grow and what to let die. Later that afternoon, I settled into my favorite armchair by the window with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and the garden glistened in the muted light. Some might have called my absence from the courtroom a missed opportunity, a chance to look them in the eye one last time. But I knew better. Being there would have kept me tethered to the ugliness, the betrayal. Staying home was my way of cutting that final string. The phone rang once, twice, then stopped. I didn't check the caller ID. Whoever it was could wait. When evening came, my friends arrived with homemade bread and stories from their week. We gathered around the table, bowls of stew steaming in front of us, candles flickering against the soft patter of rain. There was warmth here, not the staged warmth of a dinner meant to manipulate, but the genuine kind that grows between people who respect each other. We didn't toast to freedom or justice. We didn't need to. The unspoken truth was enough. I had survived, I had rebuilt, and I was exactly where I needed to be. After everyone left and the house was quiet again, I stepped outside to the garden. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth. I stood there for a long time, breathing it in. Daniel and Sophie's choices had tried to strip me of everything I'd worked for. Instead, they'd taught me the value of what couldn't be taken: self-respect, resilience, and the quiet dignity of a life lived on my own terms. And in that still moment, under the fading drizzle, I realized this was my victory, not in a courtroom, not in headlines, but here, with my hands in the soil, my home secure, and my heart at rest. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind where the world feels unhurried. I had a list in my pocket: bread, milk, fresh herbs for the weekend stew, and no reason to rush. The grocery store was only a few blocks away, a small family-owned market where the cashier knew my name. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of coffee from the small cafe in the corner. I was halfway through the produce section debating between romaine and butter lettuce when I heard a small voice behind me. "Excuse me. Are you Mrs. Evelyn?" I turned, expecting perhaps a neighbor's grandchild. Instead, I saw a girl of about 12, thin and bright-eyed, clutching a box of cereal to her chest. Her hair was the same deep chestnut as Sophie's, her expression a mix of curiosity and nervous excitement. "Yes, I'm Evelyn," I said slowly. "Do I know you?" She shook her head. "No, but I know you. From a picture." A picture. My mind flipped through possibilities, unsure whether to be concerned. "What picture is that, dear?" Her voice softened, almost reverent. "My mom. She showed me when I visited her. She said you were the kindest, bravest person she's ever met." The words hit me like a gentle but unexpected tide. For a moment, the shelves and fluorescent lights seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us in a quiet bubble of truth. "Who's your mother?" I asked, though I already felt the answer forming. "Sophie Miller," she said, her eyes steady. "She's my mom." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself against the cart. Sophie had never mentioned a daughter, not in all the years I'd known her, and yet here she was, living proof of a life beyond the one I'd seen, a connection Sophie had kept private. "She told me what happened," the girl continued, her voice trembling slightly. "She said she made terrible mistakes, and that you still stood up to protect yourself even though it hurt." I searched the girl's face for some hint of manipulation, but found only sincerity. "Did she say why she told you about me?" "She said she didn't want me to make the same choices she did. She said if I ever meet you, I should say thank you for being strong when she wasn't." Something in my chest shifted then. Not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the knot that had sat there for months. "Well," I said gently, "thank you for telling me. That's very brave of you." She smiled, a shy, fleeting curve of the lips, and then her guardian, an older woman with tired eyes, called her from the next aisle. Before she left, she turned back. "Mom says you like gardens. I do too." And just like that, she was gone, her small figure disappearing between stacks of canned goods. I stood there for a long moment, the cool air brushing against my skin, the hum of the store settling around me. Sophie's words, carried by her daughter, weren't an apology in the traditional sense. They didn't erase what she had done, but they planted something. A quiet recognition that people can change, even in the smallest ways, even behind prison walls. When I stepped back into the afternoon sun, the bag of groceries felt lighter in my hands. The street smelled faintly of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the block. Life moved on. Children laughed in the park. A man walked his dog. The world spun exactly as it had before. But inside, there was a difference. I didn't forgive Sophie out loud, and I didn't plan to. Some things weren't meant to be tied up neatly, but I carried with me the knowledge that somewhere she had found a way to honor the truth, even if it came too late. That was enough. At home, I unpacked the groceries, placing the lettuce in the crisper, the milk on the fridge door. Outside, my garden waited, rows of green thriving in the late afternoon light. I stepped into it barefoot, letting the soil press cool against my skin. I thought of Sophie's daughter, of the courage it took to speak to a stranger. I thought of Margaret, who would have seen this as a sign, not of reconciliation, but of peace. And as I knelt to tend the young tomato plants, the knot in my chest loosened a little more. The sun dipped lower, painting the garden in shades of gold. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. I looked at my hands in the dirt, at the life still growing here, and I smiled. Not because everything was healed, but because I had learned to live with the scars, and even see the beauty in them.